Okay, then, again, a very warm welcome. My name is Katrin and I'll be the facilitator or one of the facilitators for this webinar. Welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Before anything else happens, I would like to invite the hosts of this and organizers of this webinar to say a few words of welcome. It will first be Mrs. Laktisha Tidwamulomoni from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in South Africa. And then Mr. Gaute Vogt Hansen from the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Norway. The two of them represent the South Africa-Norway Strategic Partnership to support the DSI discussions. And then Andreas Getkant, the new head of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative from GIZ. For now, I will stop sharing my screen and I invite Laktisha to please turn on your mic and your camera and provide your words of welcome. Thank you, Laktisha.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. I would like to start by saying distinguished participants from all UN regions, the CBD Secretariat, invited expert speakers, all stakeholder groups, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Government of South Africa to this important update session on the outcomes of the work of the Co-Chairs Advisory Group on DSI, which took place recently from September to November 2021. The work of the advisory group was built from the outcomes of part 1 of the third open-ended working group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which took place from the 23rd of August to the 3rd of September this year. Distinguished participants, it is indeed a great honor to acknowledge that this webinar was organized by the ABS Capacity Development Initiatives in the context of the ongoing Norway and South Africa Strategic Partnership in facilitating informal global DSI dialogues in support of the formal processes. This webinar was organized as a contribution in the preparation for the upcoming resumed third open-ended working group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which has recently been postponed until further notice by the CBD Secretariat. And that was due to the uncertainties posed by the Omicron variant and the resulting travel measures and restrictions. I hope the outcome of this webinar will assist in your preparations for the upcoming CBD negotiations on DSI and further advance the work on DSI under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol on ABS. South Africa is very proud to be part of the community of nations that are committed to ensure conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from the utilization of genetic resources, including DSI, for the present and the future generations. Lastly, I would like to offer my deepest sympathy to all the participants that had lost their loved one through COVID-19 pandemic. And with these remarks, I therefore wish you all a fruitful discussion. And thank you very much for your attention. And I will now hand over to our Norwegian partner. Thank you very much.
Yes. Gaute, please. Can you turn on your microphone and camera?
Yes.
And maybe, oh yes.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Laktisha, and Catherine for assisting me. The purpose of the informal advisory group was to provide advice and feedback to the co-chairs in line with its mandate 14/20 from 2018 and the executive secretary on digital sequence information on genetic resources in preparations for the third meeting of the open-ended working group. As Letitia mentioned, of course, now the meeting is postponed to March, and it's really important to resolve the issue of digital sequence information, also in the context of the negotiations of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the task of the group was then to provide advice and feedback on the undertaking of an assessment of consequences of possible policy approaches, options, and modalities for benefit sharing arising from the utilization of digital sequence information on genetic resources, as well as areas of potential convergence and areas of divergences based on the summary prepared by the co-leads annexed to the report of the third meeting of the open-ended working group. And lastly, areas of additional work on DSI that may be required in the period between the third meeting of the open-ended working group and the 15th meeting of the conference of the parties. And the group had the opportunity to consider existing and potential forthcoming inputs, such as studies, dialogues, views, etc., from formal and informal activities related to DSI. So in a very short period of time, the group worked diligently on the methodology for the assessment of consequences of possible policy approaches, options, and modalities. I think the multi-criteria analysis methodology can prove helpful to parties and others in developing their positions. But as was underlined in the group, this is a step-by-step process, as you can also find underlined in the report. Today's webinar will be useful to get the work on the group known to a bigger circle of stakeholders, which input is crucial for the DSI process in order for the open-ended working group to conclude its mandate. I wish us a fruitful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaute, for your words of welcome. And I would like to invite Andreas Getkant, the new head of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. And if you want me to share the screen, then please let me know. Andreas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. A warm greetings from Bonn. My name is Andreas Getkant, and I'm the new project manager of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. And I'm very much pleased to see how many people we are here for this informal session, informative session on the on DSI. As you all know, COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh acknowledged the divergence of views among parties and on benefit sharing from the use of DSI. And then we have this commitment by the parties to work towards resolving this divergence and looking for convergence through a science and policy-based process and further consultations. The ABS Capacity Development Initiative took up this and continued to working together with on DSI in the context of the Norwegian and South African Environmental Cooperation Program. And so far, we realized more than 4 webinars on specific aspects of digital sequence information. We organized also together with others, with the partners, a global dialogue on DSI, who brought together government experts, negotiators, and stakeholders as academics and private sector, but also representatives from indigenous peoples and local communities for these discussions. The objective also always was to support an informed exchange on DSI during the open-ended working group 3 in the context of the future post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So complementary to the formal intersessional process, which is preparing for the open-ended working group, with informed by submissions on DSI by the parties and further analysis of the policy approaches, options and modalities, and the Co-Chairs Informal Advisory Group on DSI with a report of the Kohlis, which we will discuss later on. We complementary have a contribution to this, to an informal intercessional process, and the ABS initiative therefore organized also this meeting to focus on informing and discussing this key document and topics and processes related to DSI discussions. So this process of complementary informal intercessional activities is inspired and guided by also by the Kohlis of the contact group, and I'm very much are grateful also for having this support for this meeting today. I only want to highlight also that the key documents you will find also on the CBD homepage under meetings from the working group 2020, and I'm very much grateful to see that we are so many people today to have a first look on new informations on this process and to exchange on this document. And I wish us all a very fruitful and constructive discussion and inspiration also for the ongoing process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your words and the information that you gave. The presentation will be shared later, so you will also be seeing the link there. So I will share my screen again to have a look at the agenda with you. And that is it. It's quite slim and light today, it looks, but I think full of very interesting content. So we've already heard the welcome words. And after this agenda overlook, we're going to have a presentation to give an overview of what's in the IAG report. And Suhail Al-Janabi from the ABS initiative will start and say a little bit about the background of this working group or advisory group and the context. And then Timothy Hodges, whom I will also introduce a little bit later, because as you see, he'll be on the panel. Timothy Hodges will be presenting the main content and results of what is there in this report. As most of you will know, is that Timothy Hodges is based in Montreal in Canada and works at the McGill University and is in the Department of Strategic Global Affairs of the Institute for the Study of International Development. So already a brief introduction of Tim. And then after we've heard these presentations, which we believe will take about maybe 20 minutes or maybe 25, something like this, we'll have a small panel who will reflect on what has been presented. And the panel consists again of Tim and then also Margot Bagley and Christopher Lyle, which you probably, many of you know, and I will introduce them all later on when we get there. And then after they've had some initial reflection and discussion amongst themselves, we'll have the opportunity for you to ask questions or comment on the panel, and I will explain in more detail how that is going to work as we get there. You are invited to already put questions or comments in the chat whenever you would like to, or discuss amongst participants. My suggestion is that we all first listen to the presentations and then start discussing on the panel and in the chat. That's that for me and for now, and let's just have a look. Yes, I'll just briefly stop share and ask Suhail and Chris to briefly show who they are, because later on we'll mostly hear your voices when I share the screen again. So maybe we can see Suhail and also Tim very briefly. Yes, and yes, here we are. Hello Suhail, hello Tim. And I will turn off my video and share the screen and hand over to Suhail, who is going to speak about the report.
Yes, indeed, and good time of the day to everyone. Yes, let's try to get into more of the process and the substance of this report commissioned by the co-leads with respect to DSI. The idea is that I'll provide a bit of a background, the context, and that then Tim dives into the content and also the processes outlined in there. Next slide. So if we look at the DSI related process, where are we now actually? We may recall that during the first part of the working group on the framework in August into September, that the co-chairs, Basil van Havre and Francis Ogwal, they established a so-called informal co-chairs advisory group on DSI, and that this group was led by so-called co-leads, which are at the same time also our hosts today, with Letitia Tsitvolemoni from South Africa and Gaute Vogt-Hansen from Norway. And as we see on the right-hand side, this is basically so who has nominated the co-chairs, then the co-leads, and they in return then led this famous informal advisory group. Next slide. And so what's the purpose? Gaute has briefly outlined it already. The purpose is the provision of feedback and advice to the co-chairs, the executive secretary, on digital sequence information in preparation of now the second part of the working group that was planned to take place in January in Geneva, but is now shifted to March, so that there's a clear flow, as we see, of information and a report back as sketched out below on the slide. Next, the tasks, if one so wishes. The task of this advisory group was, on the one hand, to undertake an assessment and of consequences, policy approaches, options, and modalities for benefit sharing arising from the utilization of DSI. So what could possible impacts be related to these different topics? To look at the potential convergences and divergences that were already summarized by the co-leads after the first part of the working group, stemming in particular from the contact groups. Then, of course, to look also further in what else needs to be done, areas of additional work that may be required between the working group and COP, and also how that could be underpinned and informed with studies, dialogues, be it in the formal or informal realm around DSI. Next, so who convened? So there was at the core 26 government representatives and further also representatives of indigenous peoples and local communities, as we see here. I'm not going to read them out, but you do see that it was selected in a regionally balanced way in terms of governments, all important governments represented, and then from the different biocultural regions, also then participation from representatives from indigenous peoples and local communities. Okay, and next, how did they meet and when did they meet? So where initially 4 meetings were scheduled, then 1 additional meeting was fed into the agenda. So there were 5 meetings, 1 + 4, a first one in September, which was rather the kickoff on organization of work and logistics and administration, basically to prepare for the upcoming substantial sessions. And then we do see that in October and November, elements raised, such as what were the key topics that were found in the compilation of submissions by parties and other stakeholders. Also a first draft of this multi-criteria decision-making frameworks, and we will get back to that in a minute. And then from this presentation of how frameworks could look like, these multi-criteria decision frameworks, then also a draft presentation of a specific one that looked at the policy options and criteria in the discussion related to DSI, the so-called metrics. Then in the consecutive session, feedback was collected on this assessment framework, and there were quite interesting inputs with respect to key topics that are being discussed, like open access and traditional knowledge from experts, and of course, further these areas of convergence and divergence were touched upon. More getting into depth than in the last October session, a deeper dive into approaches, definitions, considerations of open data and traditional knowledge took place, and also a broader discussion on further areas of potential convergence and apparent divergences, and a first consideration on how this report could look like that would need to be presented to the working group. And then finally, at the last meeting, comments and were integrated in the framework and criteria, and of course as well in the other topics of interest, convergence and divergence, consideration of recommendations for what needs to be done further, and then laying out the planning of the co-leads report on the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group, which is quite a mouthful of a title. And what's in it, I think this is what I'm going to hand over to present to my colleague, Tim. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Suel. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I have 15 minutes to describe some of the key aspects of the IAG report. And of course, as you know from the agenda, we have our esteemed colleagues of the IAG here with us today, and they will have an opportunity to amplify or clarify what I've said, or maybe even correct me if necessary. I'm assuming that most of the participants here today have at least glanced at the IAG Kohli's report, and assuming that most of you, in fact, know what DSI, the issue, generally means and what the acronym stands for. If you're not sure what DSI stands for, then you're probably taking part in the wrong webinar today. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I have no formal role in the process, and I do not subscribe to a particular point of view or position. Obviously, I didn't take part in the IAG meetings, as you can see from the list of members, and I have absolutely no insider access to those discussions. But where I hope to add value and some insights is from my fairly wide-ranging experience in ABS and in biosafety negotiations, the CBD more broadly, and well beyond the CBD. As we've heard, the purpose of this webinar is to build awareness of the report, in my mind, with a view to supporting greater understanding and perhaps progress in working through DSI in the broader context. I'm not here to critique the contents or the process of the report per se, but nevertheless, I hope to be as candid as possible. Let's start with some general comments about the content. Well, in my experience, this IAG is not much different than similar such groups that convene to advance technically complex and obviously politically divergent issues. So put simply, the DSI IAG is really no different than similar groups convened to the CBD over the years. What this means, in my mind, is that any expectations held that the group would actually conclude with a breakthrough would have been entirely unrealistic. What we should realistically expect, and what is delivered by this IAG, is less than full convergence on the report itself. No surprise. That doesn't mean, in my mind, that this group has failed. Actually, as I think a close reading of the report does actually, in fact, confirm a number of concrete and constructive ideas to move subsequent discussions forward are in that report. Further, while not solely about the IAG report, I feel that it might be helpful in the broader DSI context to note the following. I still see an absence of full discussion on policy objectives, not policy options. We have that, but policy objectives. Also, I'm not, perhaps I haven't been privy to these discussions, but I don't see a vision. I don't see a discussion of where we want to be in the next 5 years on DSI or in DSI in the broader context. I don't think we've had a sufficient discussion of that, but maybe there's time yet to do that. I also think it's important as we reflect on the report, the contents of the report, what's changed since the DSI contact group's last session? Have we advanced understanding, or have we teased out some of the sub-issues with a positive result? That's a question. So let's move now to the report itself. I have only 2 slides today to share with you. And if we could cue slide 1, that would be great. If not, not a problem, because I'm simply going to follow, in my remarks, the structure of the report, which I assume you have in front of you or on the screen. I'll start with the organization report of the report and then focus on its main components. So let's go to the structure. So we have 3 sections in the report: an introduction, section 2, outcomes of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group, and finally co-leads conclusions in section 3 and recommendations from the discussion of the IAG. So introduction, outcomes, advisory group, and co-leads conclusions. Section 1, the introduction. Well, we've already heard about the terms of reference, which is contained in the introduction, so we have no need to look into that any further. I think that was the terms of reference were quite clear to all. We've also seen the composition of the described of the group itself and how those nominations took place. I would just simply note here that as we, and perhaps this is an obvious point, but nevertheless, it's maybe useful to state the obvious. It's clear that those participants, those members of the IAG, are all experts in their own right. There's no question in my mind. And many, if not the majority, either have been or will be members of national delegations. And many of those are in fact seasoned expert negotiators. That's important to note, particularly in the light of the results generated and the results not generated by the IAG. But I'll get back to that later, perhaps. I did notice that the IAG had been briefed by 2 experts, and perhaps I've missed it, but I actually haven't seen what those presentations were about in any detail. I do wonder if it might be helpful, if possible, to actually share those presentations of the 2 experts that's referenced in the report. Just an idea. Let's move to section 2, outcomes of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group. The first subsection here deals with a framework for the assessment of policy options related to access and beneficiary of DSI on GRs. I think it's important, clearly it's important to note that in the co-lead's reflections on the discussions in the IAG, the co-lead's reflections, we actually have a first reference to what the IAG proper agreed with. And that is, as already noted by Gauta, they agreed that we should take a step-by-step approach. And secondly, that along the way, assumptions and limitations should be made explicit, reflecting different understandings of key concepts, such as what constitutes an appropriate approach or modality, as an example. That's what the IAG appears to have agreed on, where there's no space between or amongst the members of the IAG. That's a good basis for further work, I think. The methodology, I'd like to say just a few words on the methodology. The description of the methodology, I think, is it's very open. It's actually quite clear. What isn't, and probably there isn't enough space for it, what isn't really discussed is, I think, enough, is where this kind of methodology comes from, and specifically what some of its limitations are. Although to the credit of the co-leads and in the report, it's clear that this methodology isn't proposed as a solution to all the issues that are raised, all the difficulties that are raised in a subsequent analysis that might take place. But it is a methodology that's really borrowed from engineering and then applied, so a quantitative approach, then applied in a qualitative context. That's fine, but again, it has its limitations, and I think the biggest limitation is that it's based it uses a set of large assumptions, and we need to be cognizant that that assumptions are underlying and could in fact affect the result, the outcome, and actually they in fact do. But nevertheless, I think it's a promising and a useful methodology. Policy options. So Q slide 2, if we have it, you will see on page 11 of the report itself, there is a performance matrix, and it's already been referenced. And the performance matrix, in effect, really is what I want to talk about for the next several minutes. It might be useful for you to turn to the matrix now, and let's just talk about the options. So these are all familiar to you. Options 0 through 5, you'll be familiar with. They came to us from the co-chairs third webinar, as mentioned. I suspect you'll also be familiar with option 6, which was proposed in virtual meetings. And then there are 2 interesting hybrid options, first taken from submissions to make note of, but as the co-leads rightly point out, the hybrids are not included in the matrix, but discussed in the report due to methodological limitations. Now the criteria, subcriteria, and scoring. Again, we're looking at the performance table here. Looking at the left-hand column of the matrix, you can get a useful snapshot of the current criteria, the emerging criteria. I think we've lost the word goals through the process, but at one point, but now we have criteria and subcriteria. And of course, the important question of scoring, which I will get back to. I do urge you to, if you haven't, to actually read the report in terms of criteria, a description of those criteria, because I think that's really the heart and where a lot of the value lies in the report itself. and where there's plenty more discussion needed. And finally, there's a subsection 6, which is the performance matrix itself. Let's move to subsection 2B, the co-lead summary of the discussion of potential convergence and apparent divergence of the IAG. Again, in many ways, this is the second part of the report, where we get a glimpse at content, the tone and the tenor of the discussions of the IAG, and I guess the current state of play of those discussions. I know you've all read this subsection, and that you'll note that it is the co-lead's impressions that are recorded here. As the group itself, at least in my mind, my interpretation of what's written, clearly we're reluctant or unable to agree on the description of where convergence and divergence lie. Actually, this alone is a useful indication of the kind of temperature of the discussion so far, and perhaps also serves as a barometer for future discussions. I'm not very keen on the terminology that has been employed in terms of qualifying, describing what potential convergence is and what apparent divergence is, but that's only a secondary concern, and maybe I can talk about that later. In general terms, the co-leads appear to indicate, for my reading of the report, that the IAG did not reach any major breakthroughs. In terms of advancement, areas of divergence are found where you would expect to see those areas of divergence, and in terms of progress, and similarly in terms of advancement on areas of convergence, the same thing. No surprises there, I think, from my perspective. That's not a bad thing. That simply helps us to focus in maybe subsequently on where there's more separation between members of the group, and also obviously between parties. On a personal note, I'm very pleased to see the idea of future-proofing had some traction in the group. I'm not sure if it's actually possible to future-proof anything in terms of policy or legal issues, but it is important to start that discussion. As I and others have been saying more recently, we must, I think, deal with the reality that current treaty and policy-making approaches at associated institutions are really largely inadequate when it comes to responding and anticipating rapid complex change, particularly as it emanates from advancement in science and technology. So that's a really important issue. Whether that can be resolved in the IAG is another matter, but I think it's a good place and a good opportunity to start a discussion. Finally, section 3, the co-lead's conclusions and recommendations from the IAG. There are really just 4 elements emerging from the discussion in the views of the co-leads that are clearly potential elements of a recommendation. And of course, we see that in subsequent documentations that have been issued through the Secretariat in terms of preparation for the resumed OEWG. And you've read the reports, so you know that they include mention of benefits, access to DSI in terms of open access, indigenous peoples and local communities are recognized, and finally capacity building seen as an integral part of the solution on DSI. I won't comment on these elements, but I would say that in some degrees they seem quite minimal, but nevertheless they are significant. There is something, there is a foothold here to make stronger, faster advancements, I think, in the future work of the IAG or subsequent body. Section 3B, areas of further consideration towards convergence, and I'm wrapping up shortly. It's not surprising that the question of modalities has not attracted consensus. I don't think that would surprise anybody. And I do actually think that's fine. I think we have to walk before we run. And in fact, there's a danger that by talking about the majority views and emphasizing convergence, there's an unconscious tendency to discount minority views and concerns underpinning the minority view. So I think we shouldn't be afraid of talking more openly about divergence to better understand what's behind, there may be a minority view, but what's behind those concerns. They're not always invalid, absolutely not. Finally, the mandate to advance work on the multi-criteria analysis and for continuation of work on the IAG. Again, most committees will advocate for continuing their work. This certainly group and the co-leads have done so. And I think that's fine because it's a very strong basis for further work. I think completion of the multi-criteria analysis, the policy options, is a valid exercise. In doing the exercise itself maybe is helpful is actually what might come out the other end. And I think in terms of that possible analysis, we will not get a policy recommendation because it's not a decision-making process, but the discussion itself will help ultimately, I think, in informing policymakers and decision makers on DSI. So with that, I will stop here, and I will now turn to our co-leads for some corrections and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this overview. And indeed, we invite Letitia and Gaute to add or correct or complement from their experience in the group. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Should I start, Letitia?
Yes, please, you can start.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Tim. I think this was interesting and having this sort of outside view of the process, because of course, like Tisha and me, we were on the inside. So we have our views of the process, of course. I think you started with an interesting note that you noted that there was also some results not generated, and also saying or noting that the group was sort of there were many seasoned delegates there, and this is a very good observation, I think, because I mentioned as well that this is a step-by-step process, and you also said that you shouldn't be running from the start. So we have to do a fair bit of walking here, and that ties in with the step-by-step process, of course, because this is, we have to be mindful that we are sort of we weren't negotiating in the group as such, but this is of course linked to the negotiations. So it's important, in my view, to sort of not run, but actually to walk, and the purpose of walking is then to have everybody on board in the process as well. And of course, there are different viewpoints on DSI. This is something we know. And as you said, the heart of the report is then the performance matrix, which I think actually is highly useful to shape or to inform the discussions that needs to take place among stakeholders and of course among parties. And it's a useful sort of overview of criteria or elements that we want parties to reflect on when shaping their positions, in my view. As a co-lead, so I'm here to solve the issues. I'm here to solve the problem. That's how I see my task as a co-lead. And as I said in my welcoming words, this is an important issue to solve. But we can't run by doing it. We need to walk at least first. So thank you, Tim, for those remarks. I think there were good observations. Thank you.
Letitia, please. You are muted, Letitia.
Okay, sorry. I started talking and forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Gaute, and also thanks to Suel, who take us through the process towards the establishment of the advisory group and the appointment of the co-lead, myself and Gaute. And also thanks to Tim for giving us a very high level reflection on the report, which is actually a true reflection of what is contained in the report. So you have actually thoroughly covered all the aspects that the advisory group looked at and actually worked on. But I think we need to also acknowledge and that there's a lot of work that really needs to be attended to under the topic of DSI. And given the limited time that we were given from the first part of the open-ended working group, which was actually, I think, the very first formal process where parties were given the opportunity to discuss the matter like in detail, and that was further taken through the small group of the advisory group. I think we really need to all acknowledge that this is a complex topic which really requires a structured approach. So what we have in terms of the current document is a mix of policy options that we were not even sure in terms of the shape they're going to take. And that is how we ended up through the advice of the advisory group that we go through the step-by-step approach. And the main objective for that approach is basically to narrow down the list, because right now we are sitting with about a list of 6. Of course, in that list, there's potential for hybrid approach that we are so far not even clear in terms of the shape of that hybrid will look like. But the approach that we have actually taken, we believe that it will be able to help us, and I'm grateful that, Tim, you are in support of us in that approach, that we take it to further expand our understanding of the options that we have put on the table that are intended to provide a solution for DSI. And you've also highlighted quite interesting gaps in the current process, which I think they are going to be very useful going forward, especially after we have actually narrowed down the list and we sort of have an idea of the solution that is coming out of this process. I think then we can start talking about maybe issues of the objective of that particular policy. Of course, there are some elements that are already coming out, but not necessarily identified as a solid objective of the policy, but maybe going into what is desired under the DSI topic. I think that will really help us a lot to look at that. And also the visioning process still need to be done on the ideal solution, because currently it's just a mix of them and we don't know which one is the ideal solution as we speak. But otherwise, thank you very much for giving us courage not to run away from the areas of divergence in our discussion. The interesting thing around that component of the areas of convergence and the divergence was that when we come out of the first part of the working group, we had quite a number of list elements that seems to appear under areas of convergence. But when we went into the advisory group, then we started to get a sense of further understanding, which moves some of them to areas of divergence. So there's more that is still going to be done under the areas of divergence and the convergence, and also in terms of the further work that needs to be undertaken on the multi-criteria analysis approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaute and Laktisha, for these reactions. So I think we've all got quite some background now on the report. I see in the chat the question that where the report can be found. It can be downloaded. Maybe one of the colleagues can post the link in the chat to downloading the report. Now, I think we're ready for the discussion, and so briefly to explain you how that's going to work, I'm going to share my screen again. So first of all, we've got a small but very fine panel this time, only 3 people, but with a lot of expertise and experience. Tim Hodges, we've already heard him from the in Strategic Global Affairs from the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University in Montreal. We've got Margot Bagley, who is Arthur Griggs Candler Professor of Law at the Emory University School of Law in Atlanta. And we've got Christopher Lyons from the Department of Life Science at the Natural History Museum in London. All 3 of them have been, I think, as far as I know, not involved at the political level, but very much involved in the discussions around both ABS and DSI. So, and they come with different perspectives. Probably starting by Tim, I would assume, we will ask them to engage in a conversation among the 3 of them about their thoughts and reflections of the report as it stands now. Or we don't have a panel facilitator. We wanted to just have a good conversation between the 3 of them. There are not that many, so we're confident they will be able to organize themselves. In total, we'll now have almost 1 hour for discussion. So we'll start with this panel, maybe 1/3 of the time, approximately 20 minutes or so, plus minus, where they discuss amongst themselves. And while that is happening, you can already start typing your comments and questions in the chat. And my colleagues Hartmut Meyer and Suhail Al-Janabi from the ABS Initiative will be constantly looking at the screen and see what topics and questions or clusters of topics and of questions and comments come up. So this is an attempt to, with this large audience, to organize a little bit the topics and not just go by who raises their hand first, but rather compile topics. Then from a certain point on, I will ask Hartmut and Suhail, probably in an alternating way, starting with Hartmut, to present or to tell us about questions and comments they found in the chat, 1 question or comment at a time. And we will forward that to the panelists who can react on those questions or comments. That is, they will endeavor to address them. In case we are not able to respond or to treat all questions and comments this time, you can, as always, be sure they will not be lost. The chat will be saved, and we will use them to inform further topics and orientations of future webinars and dialogues. So back to our panel. This is our panel. And so I ask our 3 panelists, Tim and Margot and Chris, to turn on their cameras and their microphones, and so that we can see you all on the panel and see the actual conversation. So you're welcome. The floor is yours. I guess Tim is probably going to give it the first go to get this started. Thank you very much. We're curious.
Thank you, Catherine. And I guess I could start. And just full disclosure, we, of course, we know one another, and I think we generally respect one another. But we really haven't had a discussion amongst the 3 of us on some of the content of the report yet. So this should be interesting. I mean, there's a danger that we'll agree entirely with one another. And this may be the shortest panel discussion in the history of the CBD, but I think it's likely that we may have some difference of views perspective. So we've got about a half an hour to have the first round amongst ourselves. And then as Catherine mentioned, we're going to open it up to, thankfully, to others to pose questions and comments via Hartmut and Suel. I thought we could do this first round. The three of us focused on the multi-criteria matrix, and then another round, a second round on areas of convergence and divergence, that part of the report, and then finally a third round in this first 30 minutes with a discussion on some of the reflections in the co-leads' conclusions and recommendations, and also some ideas they've proposed for additional work. But before moving to my short comments on the matrix, and of course you've heard my general comments already on the matrix, I did want to note that, and this is entirely unrelated to the matrix, but I am reminded that I've really been impressed with the high level of engagement and leadership shown in various processes related to DSI over the interim period. These are often thankless tasks, and I must say I'm really quite impressed with the degree of professionalism, the investment of time by the co-leads, for example, and also their high level of courage in helping us to go through these very difficult discussions. So I think it's important to acknowledge that from my perspective as a former co-chair. Right, so the performance matrix. So you've heard that I have sub concerns. I wouldn't describe them as major concerns about the methodology that's proposed for employment. But let's leave that there for now, because I do think it's actually one way to get through the chaos and the noise of a discussion on a very difficult, complex set of issues such as DSI. It's clear that the options, so looking at the options now, the policy options, it's not clear to me what these actually are. Are they policy options? So are they policies, a range of policies, or are they actually policy mechanisms or approaches? I'm not sure. So there's some clarity there, but I think would be helpful. And maybe there's a difference of views amongst people about what these options are. And of course, they serve as archetypes. And the problem, of course, with archetypes, and you have to start somewhere. So there's not necessarily a problem with using such archetypes, but actually this kind of, I think we both can acknowledge that the devil's in the details. And that's the problem with this sort of type of typology. It's aggregated, but actually where the friction is in the detail. So at some point, these things have to be unraveled. But that's not an argument against the methodology or the description of the policy mechanisms or options, but it is something to keep in mind. So they may actually mask where their divergence lie. And I think Letitia maybe referenced that indirectly, at least in her remarks. Again, I think the exercise going through the matrix, filling in the blanks, filling in the boxes would be quite useful. And once the ranking starts, it should be quite interesting. But I do have one question, maybe for my fellow panelists, but just more broadly for everyone. I do wonder if the IAG alone should be going through this exercise. I mean, you can't have a global discussion that actually leads anywhere in particular, is that makes decisions or recommendations. That's not what I'm advocating. But what I am wondering about is, given that the IAG members are experts, but not experts in either this methodology or this process, and they aren't actually truly independent of their country's positions, to be honest, that's fine. But it may actually be more useful if we had a broader discussion, maybe in tandem, maybe amplifying what the IAG is talking about, but a broader discussion amongst a wider range of stakeholders and experts. Just a thought. Anyway, maybe we should move now to, I've said enough, to perhaps Chris, if you wanted to go next.
Just very briefly, sorry, Tim and Chris, just very briefly, if at any point you think it would be useful to show the matrix again, for example, please indicate it to me and I'll just share the screen again. and take it then down again when appropriate, when you let me know. Sorry, thank you, Chris.
Thanks. I don't think I need it at the moment. And thanks, Tim. It's a nice sort of starting point. I'd like to say, first of all, in response to one of your questions there, that I've always viewed these policy options as part of a blueprint for something operational, because if we're not talking about something operational, then it's very difficult to look at the criteria, because those criteria, the elements of it, they've got to be implemented in some way. They've got to reflect the implementation. So to my mind, we're talking about ultimately something that's going to be implemented and in place. So on the matrix, now I think this is potentially a really helpful tool. I tried to construct something similar myself some months ago, and I found it really hard to do. Not to construct the matrix, but to complete it. I think one of the very important parts of the discussion in the text about this matrix is the requirement to state reasoning and assumptions for any score that's given, because otherwise the scores are just sitting there without any context. I would also say, in response to your point about should the IAG be the only ones doing it, absolutely not. I think it's a really useful thing for all of us to have a go at, because that helps us think about what this is really going to deliver and what the issues are. So, but in terms of actually trying to record some sort of results from the matrix, it would be great to have a wider group doing it and have their results being assessed. And they could include representatives from the different stakeholder groups. There's already been a point made by several people in the chat about the involvement of the private sector, for example. It would be good to know what private sector's representatives thought about these criteria. Database managers, researchers, there's a whole raft of people who are real key stakeholders in anything that's put in place, that would have their own views on these criteria. Now, some key challenges about this matrix, and Tim, you already mentioned potential for IAG members who represent countries to be following in some way the national position. And yeah, I mean, we all have our assumptions and axioms we work with, however consciously or unconsciously. I did a little thought experiment myself and tried to complete bits of the table wearing a different policy hat, if you like, or trying to think myself to a favor of one solution or another. And some of my answers did differ. Now, the various options are very broad brush. And to assess some of them are really challenging without a qualification of some sort. So, for example, the first criterion, the potential to deliver predictable monetary benefits. Well, if, for example, I had a preference for option one of the various policy options, I can think of a model for implementing that, and it's based on a model implemented in at least one country already, which would give a fairly predictable baseline set of monetary benefits. On the other hand, if I favored option three, I could regard option one as delivering very low financial predictability based on a ad hoc contract income. I could do that in two different ways. Again, really important to be clear about what the assumptions are, what the rationale is for a decision made. I'm not all clear if all of the assessment criteria can or will be assessed independently. For example, if one of the options is seen to be very complex administratively and thus score low for that, will that cause a low score for the effectiveness of achieving policy goals? Because it seems to be, if it's too complex to implement, it's not going to achieve the policy goals. So how independent can these criteria actually be? So I think, yeah, I'm going to just end there and just say that it is there are all sorts of dependencies. There are all sorts of sub-options and different concepts. It is just really important for those comments about the rationale to be written down very carefully, and in such a way that they can be assessed by whoever it is going to assess this matrix and its results.
So I should just go next. All right. And first, I'd really like to thank the ABS Initiative for hosting this webinar and giving us this opportunity and inviting me to participate. I agree with, I don't think we'll ultimately agree on everything, but I agree really with a lot that Chris has said about the benefits and the challenges with this matrix. I do applaud the co-leads and the members of the group for taking this approach. Any approach is going to have challenges, of course, but trying to tackle the issue of DSI with an orderly, structured process, I think, is a valuable effort. And the discussion, as Letitia noted, that went into that process was helpful. And I can see where that would be the case. As to your question, Tim, sure, I definitely think that having a wider group of stakeholders and interested parties engage in the scoring process would be quite valuable. But I also think that having the IAG take a first stab at it will be useful as well, because that will, I think, create the opportunities for fruitful discussion about the objective validity of the scoring and how the different positions of the folks involved are reflected in those scores. But I also agree with Chris that I'm not sure how you, or maybe this is a slightly different point, how you are going to score some of the criteria without a fairly clear picture of the modalities for particular options. And that's just not something that has been addressed yet. And I think that is, I'm going to call it really the elephant in the room, because it's very difficult to converge on a particular option without knowing what it's really going to look like in implementation. And so until we start having those meaningful modality discussions, we're going to be limited, I think, in the progress. The IAG will be limited in the progress that it makes towards moving forward towards really convergences. Another point about the matrix, one of the objectives that was stated for the IAG was an assessment of possible consequences of the various policy approaches. And it's not clear to me how the matrix facilitates an assessment of consequences. So that's something I think that will still need to be thought through and addressed perhaps in a different way. I'll stop there.
Well, that's very interesting range of comments. Before we move to the next set of questions or section of the report, I just wanted to come back on you, Margot, not for a response necessarily, but you, as Chris have raised some really good points. And on the question of modalities, I mean, there, at least in my experience, and this is not about content really, but partly about process and partly about precedent. The challenge with the word modalities in the context at least of the CBD, but also in other international fora. Well, the challenge is it's a loaded word and it means different things to different people. I think there's the modalities in the context of, which is detail, which is important detail, which actually informs results of a discussion. There's modalities in the context of, let's say, the performance matrix and the options. And that point is absolutely valid. Unless you get into that, you're not going to really get anywhere. But then there's modalities in the use of the term in the decision, right? And that's where there's a dilemma. Because if you, and perhaps there are parties who would prefer the status quo. I mean, absolute status quo. And let's put it bluntly, I'm not aware of which ones they might be, but I gather there's at least one party that would not want to see the word modalities in a decision related to DSI, or more broadly in the context of COP15 decisions, using the word modalities. Because modalities can often lead to, one thing leads to another. So let's take the example of the ABS international regime negotiations. And similarly, actually with Cartagena Protocol. As soon as you have, and almost inevitably, as soon as there's a decision that allows for sanctions some work on modalities, then you get to the range of options which can lead to a treaty. And that's where there's some resistance, I would suspect, to actually even talking about modalities, even though in the context of policy options, modalities are absolutely essential to have a reasonable, helpful discussion, but they don't want to go there. And some people will not want to go there. But that's the reason why, not because they don't want to talk about modalities, but they don't want to talk about modalities that lead to a legally binding instrument necessarily at this time. Sorry to go on about that, but I think that is one of the elephants in the room. As a colleague back here in Canada mentioned last week, he called it a pink elephant, and I think that's a perfect word for it. Right, so next. Right, we're going to go to convergence and divergence section of the report. And as I mentioned, I don't think you need to hear from me on this one, but I do wonder about the terminology. I don't know why we just don't call them convergences and divergences, but maybe the co-chairs would explain that at some point. I'm sure there's a reason. And of course, I wasn't at the IAG, so it's a little difficult to actually go further on that one, but I think it's important to discuss further about what we mean by the terms divergence and convergence. That's kind of obvious, I guess. But again, as I said, there's nothing wrong with talking about divergence, and I think Ticia did make that point as well, because sometimes convergence disguises divergence, and sometimes the other way around, in fact, where people are assuming there's a divergence, but actually having a discussion and acquiring some mutual understanding could actually discover that there isn't really a serious divergence, which is not expected. But again, that's an argument for, in my mind, to face realities of the current problem. Right. Maybe Margot, you would like to go next on this one?
Yeah, well, just to continue with what you were saying, I thought it was interesting that, like Tisha noted, that there were some areas of seeming convergence that upon further discussion really, no, we actually do diverge. So it can go in either direction on that, but hopefully with more clarification, at least you realize where the challenges are that you need to work on. So I think the discussion and the process still is helpful overall. You had mentioned earlier, Tim, I don't think we see a lot of surprises in terms of the differing views. Yeah, there should be fair and equitable benefit sharing, but very different views on what that means and how to accomplish it. Is DSI a genetic resource? Is it within the scope of the CBD? Terminology, we've seen these time and time again. Also, and I thought this one was kind of interesting, we see this strong convergence around the idea of non-monetary benefit sharing. We've had agreement on that for a long time, but not agreement to have it simply subsumed within the other options, because I believe some participants believe that the only kind of benefit sharing for DSI outside of MAT should be these kinds of non-monetary benefit sharing. So, there's what's said and what's not said there. I also was intrigued, and I like your idea of seeing if we could hear or find out about those presentations, that contrasting focus on open data on the one hand and traditional knowledge on the other, which to me are two ends of the rope in that tug of war. that we have with DSI, if we want to think about it that way. So you've got the FAIR principles, and I thought that was very interesting to see that, and then the CARE principles, which I think highlight the tension between the desire for unfettered access to DSI and the desire for attribution, acknowledgement, connection to traditional knowledge, which seemingly would involve track and trace in some form. And accommodating these goals, which are, as I said, kind of at the end of the spectrum, I think would be quite the challenge. I was also intrigued by the area of possible convergence around cost benefit analysis, and the idea that there's convergence around the idea that to be successful, a solution on DSI must be one in which benefits exceed costs. If people really think about that, I think that could help us to narrow the field possibly in a meaningful way. There were three elements that I did not see, and maybe I just missed them. I get more each time I read the report, but that I think could be helpful to add, particularly in relation to all of the cost type questions are: one, cost to whom? I think it's really important to think about who is going to be bearing the cost. Two, a consideration of the quantum of uses evading capture relative to those being captured in terms of benefit sharing under these various options. And three, what are the responses by those most directly affected likely to be? How are people going to respond and change their behavior potentially based on a particular policy option? I think it's really important to think about those things. So for example, options 3.1 and 3.2 impose monetary costs. Yeah, 3.1 and 3.2 would impose monetary costs seemingly equally on commercial and non-commercial users of DSI. Is that the intent? And with options 1, 2.1, and 2.2, direct users who you can negotiate with have to share benefits, but downstream private anonymous users of the same DSI obtained through databases share nothing from a monetary standpoint, and their uses may far outnumber and be more commercially lucrative than the directly negotiating users. So what you're capturing and what you're not capturing, very different. And if you know that you have to pay and others do not, how might that affect your behavior? And what will these approaches incentivize researchers to do? So those are some things I think it might be important to add in terms of thinking about. I think they might lead, well, you know, help us in getting to, and when I say us, I mean us as a global community. I'm not on the IAG either, but helping to clarify positions and ramifications, and as what I mentioned before, the possible consequences of the policy options that I'm not sure are being sufficiently addressed at this point. And I'll stop there.
If I may just briefly intervene, one with a technical information, it seems that some people in the chat addressed their questions only to the panelists, and that's difficult for us to follow everything. So please make sure that when you send a question or comment, that it says on your Zoom screen that it goes to everyone, and then it goes to the panelists and also to everyone. So that's the technical remark. And the other is, it seems that there's already quite a lot in the chat. So it would be great if we could soon come to open the panel and let Suela and Hartmut bring up some issues from the chat to you as a panel. I don't know whether you need still some, maybe Chris would like to say something again, or Tim, but then let me know soon when we can open that. Thank you very much.
I would suggest that you give us max 5 minutes, but it's certainly Chris but should obviously go ahead at least on this one. But if you give us 5 minutes, and then
okay,
we will,
let's say 3 to 5.
maybe 6 minutes then. No?
Okay, thank you.
Chris?
Thanks, Tim. I'm glad you're still a negotiator at heart. I'd just like to comment on a couple of items under the convergence divergence element. And just like to emphasize, these are really, really important. Because if they're kind of foundational to anything that's put in place. And if they're not fully understood or agreed, they are going to come back and bite us. That doesn't mean that everything else has to stop while these are agreed. The whole thing is iterative, as we know, and but it's just important to carry on. One of these items is the fair and equitable benefit sharing element. Absolutely fair and equitable, but what does that actually mean in practice? Does it mean, for example, that an appropriate share of the benefits must go to the provider of the genetic resource from which the DSI was derived? If it does, then several of the options kind of don't apply. Alternatively, could it encompass sharing of the benefits so they support conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity via some sort of multilateral system that distributes them independently of the provider country of genetic resources? Now, that to me is an absolutely key question to start assessing the viability of these different policy options. One of the other sort of parts of that comes in is the whole traceability. Now I'm going to come back to traceability later. The other thing that I'll mention is the crossover into associated traditional knowledge and the role of IPRCs as stewards of biodiversity. Two very important concepts and things to discuss. And I was pleased to see that in the document, these two elements are being teased apart a bit. And this does impact track and trace if that is a part of any ultimate model. If you're looking at the stewardship concept, then that's perhaps congruent with a landscape level of biodiversity and genetic resources from that landscape, irrespective of species, whereas associated traditional knowledge is perhaps more associated with individual species. And neither of those really match well with the data currently collected by at least some of the databases. And I'll mention the INSDC consortium, because that's already been mentioned in chat and it's really important. So if those two are to be incorporated in some way, there's got to be consideration of what metadata are necessary to enable them to be addressed in any final solution. There's quite a lot more to say on that, but in the light of the 6 minutes we have, I'll stop at that time. Thanks.
Well, you've given us more
Yes.
to chew on. Anyway, Catherine, we have
Yes.
an agreement.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I think it's time. We've got a total of some, not a half hour, maybe 25 minutes left. So let's give the floor a chance. And it seems that Suel and Hartmut have already identified some clusters. So I ask Suel to go for the first question to the panel. And as the sharper the questions and the sharper the answers, the more questions or comments we can actually treat. So Suel, please.
Well, thanks a lot. And it's not an easy task to monitor what is all being asked and commented. But our suggestion is to start off with a more high-level consideration. Tim mentioned it in the beginning, and it has been picked up then also in the chat. It is on the policy objectives and the overarching vision. So referring now also to the chicken and the egg, what do we need first? Do we need the modalities and the options and then look for the policy objectives and the vision, or would we need to have the objective first and the vision, and according to that also look into which options would deliver?
Thank you, Suhail. Back to the panel.
May I? Well, I mean, the chicken or the egg. I think the point is both. We need both. And in what order? Well, to me, it makes, rationally speaking, as a former policymaker, I'd say you want to know where ultimately you want to go. And then ask the question, how do you get there? But maybe that's too rational. And in fact, there are examples, including in the CBD, where there was a lack of a broad agreement, if not consensus, about both of those things in one particular policy area. So there was no agreement on modality, the type of vehicle, how to get there, and where that vehicle was actually going. But nevertheless, discussions took place on both of those questions, even though the final decision, the resolution of it, did not occur until the final hour. So I guess my point is you need to have both, and they can even be simultaneous, but you do need to have both. And again, I actually think there's reluctance to have both, but I think it's time. Someone actually has to confront the pink elephants in the room. And I don't think there's any fear in finding out what's underneath your bed. Usually it's okay. Usually there isn't a monster hiding under your bed.
I would like to just second that, actually, that yes, normally you would want to know where you're going and then figure out how you get there. But I think there can be, when you look at the report and see the areas for further work, there is a lot of discussions that it's proposed should happen. And I think several of these discussions could happen in parallel. They don't have to all be in series. And I think it's going to be important for some of them to be in parallel, and you're not necessarily prejudging any particular outcome, but you just need to generate more data to work with to be able to properly assess them, I think, and then share information among the different groups that are discussing these issues to help inform the process as you move forward.
Yeah, I'd agree also. And also say with some of those areas of further discussion, they apply also to ABS for genetic resources, not just DSI. And it would have been great if we'd had some of those discussions earlier. I feel that where we've come from over the last few years, some parties have been changing their mind a bit. As discussions have been going on and more concepts, more thoughts have been explored, people are being able to think, actually, well, maybe that is where we want to go. Maybe that will work. And I think absolutely, Tim, once we have a clearer idea of what the options are and what they entail, it's going to be easier for parties to think through where they want to be.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm sure I saw that there's lots of more comments and questions. So Hartmut, would you like to present one to everyone?
Yes. Well, of course, it has to be a choice, but I think there's another chicken and egg issue, as it was just mentioned. I guess there are many, and it relates to the still unclarified questions of scope. So it was mentioned that, and we know that DSI is not defined yet, and also the scope of any future DSI system is really not clarified. Is it just the public databases, or is it private databases as well, etc. And then come to the question, when should a multi-criteria decision analysis be undertaken if all these, let's say, scope questions are not clear? So this also would, I think, deserve some consideration, because obviously the paper is pretty strong that this analysis should be undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you, Hartmut. And whoever from the panel would like to react first.
I think I'll weigh in on scope and try and avoid throwing a big spanner in the works. Although there are spanners which might be thrown in later, unfortunately. I've been really interested in the work that Hartmut's group has been doing over the last year or so on trying to assess where the DSI came from that has gone into the production of various commodities. And really impressed with the amount of work they've done because they've had to do it. And that gives me a concern about how any system is going to really work. And the easier way of doing it, of course, is say any DSI is within scope, wherever it comes from. And that brings in temporal scope, geographical scope, whether it's coming from a party, whether it's human or not, whether it's artificial or not. These are serious things which may come and bite us at some point. So that scope issue for me is a really, really important one. However, we do need to proceed, and it's going to be more important for some areas than others. And I think it's important to start doing that matrix now. I might do it this afternoon, I don't know, because that will inform us all of where we need to think more. It's going to show up some of these issues and really get them on the table so they can be discussed.
Thank you, Chris. More views, opinions. Obviously, we're getting opinions and views here. Tim or Margot?
Well, Chris, I look forward to seeing all the blanks filled in, and I'm sure you'll be willing to share it with all of us, not just the panel. So thank you, and by close of business today, that would be appreciated, everyone. But no, quite seriously, obviously, hugely important issue, and scope also, of course. Again, it's chicken and egg, but it's more than one chicken and more than one egg, because the question of scope obviously is related to the modality chosen as well. So, for example, if and this may be a boogeyman for some, but let's just say that ultimately the decision is made that we might investigate the possibility of some kind of legally binding instrument or requirement of some kind, right? So that will affect the width of the scope, whether it's temporal or otherwise, right? So you capture more by greater leniency and flexibility, and you capture less if you have something, more clearly delineated and maybe more sort of regulatory. So yeah, scope is extremely important, but again, it should be talked about, because that will influence a huge number of elements in the discussion, but it doesn't actually have to be decided, because one thing is dependent on another.
I agree.
Mark, would you like to add more, or shall we go on to the next point?
I can add more. I mean, I think Tim and Chris both said it very, very well. I mean, it's important, but until you know what modalities are going to look like, you're not going to really have agreement on scope. So it has to be, you have to be aware of it, but it should not stop progress from being made. You still have to have the other discussions while you're thinking about scope.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Margot. Then Suhail, I'm sure you've prepared the next.
Yeah, there are no real easy questions. Yeah,
There never are.
There never are, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into, let's say, some requirements that do come along with the set of policy options. There were two or even three remarks with respect to the question of traceability. And it's an interesting thought. This question, whether one would need to assess the possibilities of traceability in the first place before one would be able to define what type of mechanisms and options would be possible and adequate. So in other words, would one need to do this work first in order to assess whether it's feasible at all? Looking into possibilities of traceability.
Thank you, Suhail. Let's give panelists a moment to think.
I think this is not the first time we've talked about traceability. The first document I can think of, CBD document, was a substantive document, information document. I think it was 2009, about how traceability might operate, and that was to do obviously with genetic resources. I guess we're still on reciprocal illumination. We're trying to pull ourselves up by our bootlaces, but we need to think about traceability. But the policy options on the table, some need traceability, some do not need traceability. And I think the key thing here is, are we starting from a position where we believe traceability to be absolutely necessary, irrespective of anything else? Comes back to that fair and equitable question to an extent. Or are we starting from an option where it's important to have a functional system agreed and adopted, irrespective of whether it requires traceability or not? Can we ditch traceability? So there's a question to consider there. Yes, obviously, if traceability is not possible, then that would rule things out. I'd say that everything is always possible. It might be just expensive. And that's not saying anything about traceability per se, but let's think about whether we really need it, how open we are to different solutions. And also, yeah, let's find out about how it really works, if possible.
Margot?
I agree. And the point that I highlighted about, the potential convergence around cost-benefit analysis. If traceability is possible but really, really expensive, then that may not be the way to go, and that can inform discussions on the various options. But again, I see these investigations, these discussions as going on in parallel in terms of figuring out, because as Chris pointed, not all of the options would require traceability. So it's not that this is a prerequisite to moving forward, it's figuring that out.
Yeah, just to agree entirely, fully with both Margot and Chris bang on. It's simply to note that traceability and the need for traceability before a discussion about what that means and how it can be done and whether it's feasible or not, the cost, it's really about trust, right? Ultimately, it does indicate, and it just reminds me of the relatively high level, ongoing high level of distrust within the CBD, including on ABS, genetic resources, and DSI. And so that actually informs the technical discussions and the policy options. That's underlying, that's rarely said, but I know it exists. We all know it exists, and it's not very helpful, but it does exist, and it's helpful to acknowledge that it does. But again, it does go back to trust to some degree. So yeah, that's all I have to say on it.
Well, if I can just add on to that, because that's a very important point, and it's not just in the CBD. I spend a lot of time, or at least before the pandemic, at WIPO. So it seems to be a feature of multilateralism these days, and distrust from one forum, I think, can spill over into others based on interactions and expectations that are met or not met in the course of a particular series of negotiations. So it is, I don't know how it can be addressed, but yeah, it's not just the CBD.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you very much, Margot and Tim and Chris. Let's see, what else is there? Hartmut, what else have you found in the chat that the panel might be able to address?
Yes. Sorry, excuse me.
You're frozen right now.
I'm frozen.
No,
Can you hear me?
Now it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit going up and down here, but anyway. I like to focus on the role of industry. There were a lot of questions around that. And one, of course, was where is industry in this discussion? It was, for example, not included in the informal advisory group. What is their position? And we know that we didn't hear a lot yet. So I think that the one comment by Amanda McDowell, she might be from industry, is that we need an option which outlines clearly a simple global payment mechanism, etc. So I think that's a strong statement. Then also, I think it was Dirk Neumann who asked, is it enough to just concentrate on the public data banks? Because there are a lot of private data banks with industry. So should benefit sharing also include the use of these private data? Mm-hmm. So that would be, let's say, a bit more complex question, because there were, let's say, different comments or questions related to industry. So I think this would be something we should also discuss.
Let's get some views on the role of industry in this process. Thank you, Hartmut.
I think the role of industry is important because we're talking here about users, and that's one of the points I made earlier. We have to think about, you know, who the costs are going to be, who's going to bear the costs, who's going to be affected by the different policies, and so having the input of industry is definitely necessary, and especially as many governments are often operating on the basis of perceived industry interests, it would be helpful to hear from industry directly, I think, in some cases, to know whether those perceptions of the governments are actually accurate in terms of what would be most beneficial to industry. So we have many different kinds of stakeholders to which this issue is relevant. And I think to hear from all of the different voices can only help to inform what feasible solutions we might be able to come up with.
Thank you, Margot.
Yeah, just building on your comment, Margot. Well, just state, based on my experience at least, it seems to be obvious to me, is that industry, like other stakeholders, are often the entities that implement policy or regulation established by government, right? So they're the implementers in some cases, and often. So why you wouldn't invite potential implementers with stake in the game, obviously, but those entities that you look to affect policy, why you wouldn't invite them for the views? And they have been invited. Of course, we get submissions from industry, ICC, for example. But why you wouldn't invite them into discussion is beyond me. So yes, of course you would at some point. And in part, that's kind of the point I was making about, not specifically about the IAG, because it's light, it's small, it's task oriented, and there's a lot of attraction to that. But at some point you need an expanded discussion. So, and yes, of course it should be industry. And finally, again, in my experience, this I think is partly your point, Margot, asking industry directly about their views and what's possible, where's the no-go zones, whatever, can be very helpful to governments establishing their positions in a negotiation. But actually directly asking stakeholders for their views, but not as governments, but as policymakers in the global context, as a community, it's more direct. It may be not any more honest or open, but it's more direct. So yes, of course, we want industry to say what they think, how they feel, openly, so we can all hear it, not just, you know, the government of whatever country, everybody, because industry will say different things to different people. To their governments who are protecting their interests, they'll say one thing, can't go there, impossible. But actually, in a different venue with a different group of people, you may have something more open and more flexible. Yeah. Just a possibility.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'd like to come back to that matrix where I suggested earlier that we needed to hear from more stakeholders, including industry, and not just industry in the global north. Industry, because we've got industry all over the world in all sorts of countries which are making use of DSI, and it'd be really good to hear what everybody thinks. But yeah, absolutely public. I'd also like to come back to that point about the private DSI databases. I don't see any reason why those should be excluded. It's still DSI. Now, I don't know how much those databases include only data downloaded from public databases, and how much they include DSI that have been generated directly by the owners. But hey, that does seem to be a part of the equation.
Yes, thank you very much. Looking at the clock, I think we'll have time for one more, perhaps not overly complex question, and one more round of answers. So Suhail, please.
Yeah, and I'm trying to make the case for a indeed a little bit less conflictive one. It was mentioned in the first comments, it's around capacity building, right? And in the negotiations and the exchange, I think this is one of the fields of convergence, that capacity building has to take place, and maybe even as part of benefit sharing mechanism. But the question is now capacity building on what? Because that has not very much been concretized. Is it on dealing with DSI in terms of setting up policies and regulations, or is it indeed on the use and the technicalities in relation to DSI, so more from a scientific and user perspective? And do we have any good examples where one could draw then maybe from on how a workable capacity building approach could look like, in particular now in relation also to a possible benefit sharing system?
Thank you, Suhail. Would like to go first?
I would say that capacity building has taken place in a number of different levels. It's going to differ across different parts of the world, different countries. Some of it is very much about benefit sharing, some of it is much less so. So at the level of the individual scientist, like me, I might have a project involving genetic resources and DSI, entirely appropriate for part of the agreement I reach with a provider country to do some training of individuals in the biochemistry, the mechanics of how you create sequence data, how you upload it, how you download it, how you use it, all the rest of it. That's cool. If that individual doesn't have a job to go to, or doesn't have a laboratory to work in, or is operating in a science policy framework which doesn't enable them to use and apply the information, the skills they've got, then that's pretty failing as capacity building. So we've got the capacity building necessary at much larger levels, much higher levels, the institutional level, the science framework level, the industry level to enable those people to be employed, the environmental management level, because people out there in environmental management are using DSI in their monitoring of species. And those are not benefit sharing type capacity building, they're capacity building at a much higher resource mobilization and policy level. And we need to be addressing all of those. And yeah, if we implement a system that requires regulation, there's going to be a lot of capacity building there as well.
Thank you, Chris.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's important to think very broadly and creatively about what can constitute capacity building in terms of knowledge sharing, equipment sharing, education sharing. But what's critically important, in my view and in my experience, is sustained capacity building, not just coming in and leaving. It's really got to be an ongoing endeavor to really build capacity, absorptive capacity, all different kinds of capacity. But really, I think we often think too narrowly about capacity building.
Thanks, Margot.
Good. I entirely agree. It's simply 2 points. One, I do actually like the evolution in the terminology, and I think capacity development is maybe even better applied here in terms conceptually. But what's the difference? I don't know. But anyway, I think it does say something, and that we actually have been moving into CBD and elsewhere in thinking about capacity and what it actually means at range of the levels that Chris described. But I actually think the unfinished business of this CBD in particular is the capacity building component story, that really the level of success in the CBD and as a focused discussion has been wholly inadequate in my mind. And DSI in a way is another entry point to help have that discussion, have that action more than just discussion. Finally, I think the question is a good one. It's, are there examples? I'm not aware of them. I'm sure there are many, and it might be useful to actually document some of those to help inform, what we actually might do in terms of capacity and what we're talking about. But I also think there's an opportunity to establish some pilots as well. Now, not later, soon, not later. And that can be done by industry, public research, governments, but there's opportunity here. And if we're really serious about this, let's learn about it by doing.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Margot, Tim, Chris. I think this was a very interesting discussion. And of course, still lots of open questions and issues also in the chat. But as I said earlier, be sure that at least it will be recorded and try to be addressed. We'll try to address it at another occasion. For now, thank you very much for the input, for your thoughts, for your views. And we've come to more or less the end of this webinar, pretty much. And I will hand over for some final words to Hartmut. And if you want me to share the screen again, Hartmut, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think I don't need the screen. Well, first, of course, I would like to thank our 3 panelists for this very, very informative session. And then I just can quote Coleman or Crichton from our chat, who said that these are probably the 3 smartest panelists he have ever seen. So, well, yeah. And also, I'm very happy about this attempt we made to finally include the many comments we receive in all our webinars into the discussion of the panel, because now we let's say we gathered a lot of experience in these webinars, and we thought about that we should finally go there, and I think it worked out very well, and I hope that we captured a lot of the ideas and questions which were posted in the comment and put them to the panel and got a sort of a discussion with our many participants, which were like 180 or something. So with that, I like to thank all people who were participating today for the many contributions. We will, as usually, post the video on our webpage. We are going to write a short report, and I just also can announce that the reports from our last DSI webinars will be online maybe today or tomorrow, very soon, so that you can also read what has been said in those webinars. My final word is that, again, when you leave it, you will see a short evaluation of this event today, and we like to ask you to take some minutes, 1-2 minutes, to fill it in, because that is also an important information for us. Well, with that, I wish you a good day. And we see us next time on our next DSI event. Thank you.
Thanks, Hartmut. Thank you, everybody. Thanks the presenters and the panelists and all the participants for your questions and your contributions. And as Hartmut said, please take those 2 minutes to respond to our questions. And if you like, we could go back to our little tradition, and whoever can and would like to turn on your cameras so we can wave each other goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and Merry Christmas.
Yes. Oh, yes. And
we'll only continue next year.
And stay safe.
Stay safe. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.